do is a two-portal barn, and it doesn't have one side aisle. But this form becomes the most useful general agriculture barn, meaning that now you're using your barn for lots of different things. You may be raising calves for 4-H projects with your kids. You may be feeding cattle. You may be storing hay and grain. So this barn becomes bigger and bigger as the farms get bigger and bigger. But the shape maintains it. They're still building this barn today. If they want to store hay. If they don't, they're building pole barns, which only store rolled hay. So if you see these in the landscape, and you will now because now you know what they look like, you'll see how common they are. There are very few of these barns in the United States except in the East Coast. They're called Dutch barns, and the telltale is the long sloping gable roof that comes almost to the ground. In some cases, they're only a few feet off the ground. Here's a good example. This is actually a newer barn built in the Dutch barn model. But they're always transverse. The doors are on the end. They predate the transverse crib barn because these were actually built in Holland prior to settlement. And the Dutch bring them to this country and build them here, but you only really see them in the Northeast. And there are very few of them left, unless they're copied like this. But again, they're all under one big roof, and they have a very unique interior beam system, not seen in any other barn. So the German 4-bay barn is what I was calling earlier the Pennsylvania barn, and you'll see a lot of these in northern Indiana. Occasionally, I've seen maybe one or two south of Indianapolis, but it's rare. But in the central part of the state, north of Indianapolis, they become more and more common the farther north that you go, because they're approaching that migratory route that I explained to you. They're very large multi-purpose barns. The way you identify them is by the overhang on one side called the 4-bay. So that 4-bay was developed as a way for animals to get shelter. See if I can find my pointer. This 4-bay overhang. This is an unsupported 4-bay because there are no posts under it. And then this part of the barn hangs over it, usually about 6 or 8 feet. Sometimes the 4-bay is on both sides. Sometimes it's only on the end, but the most typical Pennsylvania Dutch barn has the overhang only on one side, and they frequently have a pent roof on them, but not always. They rarely have gambrel roofs. They almost always have gable roofs, but they are sometimes one slope is longer than the other. But there's very little variation in them. Well, the experts have identified several styles of them, but to look at them with an unexperienced eye, you wouldn't really notice much difference. Here's an older one, unsupported 4-bay on one side. This one has a machine shed added to the end. And that 4-bay was used as part of the upstairs part of the barn, but often it was a granary. So it was sealed off with tight rooms for storing grain. Here's a supported 4-bay with a pent roof. So there's columns on the end, a wall on the end to help support it. They always have doors out over the 4-bay, like an English barn. You can open that door. Obviously you're not going to drive out of it, but you open that door when you're threshing. People always say, how come there's a door opening up there, when you obviously can't even go through there? You can't drive through it, but you can drive a wagon up to this side and offload through those doors. There's another one. You can barely see the 4-bay hanging over on the right corner. They are almost always bank barns. They almost always have a high side drive like this that goes onto so you can drive your wagon and team onto the main floor of the barn. I say almost always because they don't always have them. And sometimes they have two ramps, one on the end and one on the side. And this is an example, another example of a very large unsupported posted forebays. You can't see the posts, but they're there. So every bank barn is not a Pennsylvania barn. So barns that are built into a hillside in order to have grade access at the lower level and wagon access on the upper level, they're built into a bank. Sometimes that bank is artificial. The farmer builds the bank in order to bank his barn into. The way these barns are used, also the Pennsylvania barns, is the lower level is used for animals. So it's usually a stone foundation, or in the later ones, concrete block or pour concrete foundation. That's where the animals are kept at ground level, and then hay and grain storage and other mechanical uses are on the dry level up above. So there's a large variation of bank barns. This is a transverse bank barn. This is an English bank barn. So you see, this barn is built in 1920. So why are they honoring English heritage with this barn? Nobody really has ever answered that question. We just know that we continue to honor the heritage of barn building. This has heavy ventilation slits in it. It's obviously post scientific agricultural revolution. It has a really nice fieldstone foundation on the bank side, and is a large hay barn. In this case, there's no bank. The farmer has built a ramp to the second floor, an earthen ramp. Here's another example, very similar configuration. Larger barn. And you notice, again, ventilation. You're also starting to see color and decoration, which comes on a little bit later as people can afford paint. But they also recognize that paint is has a sanitary quality. So whitewash and paint are used to help keep germs down on the exterior as well as the interior. Here's a variation of a bank barn with an aisle on the lower side, and here you can see how the pitch of the roof is what's called a Switzer roof. That has German origins, and a really beautiful fieldstone foundation. When you see decorative shingling, the Switzer shape, horizontal siding, and decorative shingling up in the eave, these are almost always built during the Victorian period when houses start to be real decorative on the outside. So one of the big questions I always get asked when I go to somebody's barn is, how old is it? It's not really easy to tell, but there are telltales that allow you some leeway. Hand-hewn barns are built before sawmills are large enough and common enough to saw huge timbers. So we have sawmills early on, and they're sawing with a reciprocal blade like this, usually driven by a water mill. And the carriage, the part you put your log on those mills, is usually not more than 9 to 14 feet long. Well, when you get into large barns, they're bringing whole trees in, right, for timber. This is a tree. And if you look downstairs at the size of or here at the tie beams that go across and tie the frames together, you can see that's not a branch. That's one tree. And the sawmills weren't big enough to handle that kind of material. So people had to do it by hand, and they do it with broad axes. And it's quite a skill, as you can imagine. So the sawmill, the first circular saw shows up in the United States in about 1845, but it's not, it doesn't spread or become popular until after the Civil War, particularly in the Midwest. And even then, they don't build carriages big enough for them or have enough power for them to drive all the way through the length of a 20 or 30 foot long tree. So you see hewn barns up to the late 19th century. You start to see all sawn barns after about 1880, I'm sorry. So within 25 years of the end of the Civil War, people are still hewing logs. And I've seen some barns where the largest beams, the purlin beams, the purlin beam is the long one that goes from one end to the other. Usually they're joined by several scarf joints, which is what you see right up here, where the two logs are joined. But still, it's nothing to get a 30 or 40 or sometimes 60 foot long tree trunk as a purlin beam. They're almost always hewn, even if the rest of the barn is sawn. So when you go to date a barn, you have to look at which pieces are hewn as well as whether it's hewn. If the entire barn is hewn, like this one, then you know it's before the capability of sawing a barn. And this barn is almost overbuilt. It's so well built. The timbers are on average not this big. And you really need to go downstairs to fully appreciate the heft of this barn. And it was built that way because they anticipated it holding a big load. Okay. Our ancestors who were builders, so-called master builders, before there was architecture as something that you could go to school for, probably knew more about engineering stresses than we will ever know. But it's common to see barns as a good expression of the understanding of engineering, because depending on the barn's use, the engineering was beefed up. The bents were closer together, the floor joists were closer together, the number of posts that support the floor joists are closer together, and the beams tend to be heftier, bigger. Particularly the tie beam at the end, because that's where most of the wind stress on a building is. So if you see a barn that has a small tie beam at the end, it means that the person who built it didn't understand that that's where the big stress is. And those barns will blow over because they're not strong enough to withstand wind. This one probably isn't going to have that problem. I'm sorry, you can't really see this. But I have more. This style of barn, the Wisconsin dairy barn, doesn't develop until the 20th century. It's an invention. Go back one. It's an invention of the University of Wisconsin, and it's intended specifically as a dairy barn. It has several variations. This is called a helmet roof, which gives you an enormous amount of loft space. Everything above, from the gable edge of the roof, the eave edge of the roof up, is hayloft. The windows indicate places for the cows, stalls, which are also called cribs. And this is a really lovely example, and has a really nice set of ventilators. As the 20th century progresses, all these appurtenances, ventilators and so on, are manufactured, of course. So you can go to the James Company or several other companies that are ready making all this stuff for your barn, including interior stalls, milking stanchions, and so on. Here's a variation on it. This is a barn that is basically a copy of a Wisconsin dairy barn. Not as long, and it has the English barn entrance on it. This is an elephant barn in Peru, Indiana, from the circus, from the days of the circus. These are being restored now. There are two of them. And the Indiana Barn Foundation is going to have its annual barn tour. That's going to be the headquarters of the barn tour, which will be in October, I think on the 14th, if you're interested. We usually have 7 to 8 barns on the tours, and then we have a headquarters barn that we're trying to feature. But these are being restored. It's absolutely enormous. And this is where they kept elephants in the winter. So the basement barns are another variation of a barn that's raised off the ground, similar to the bank barn. The basement is used for animals. The upper part is used for storage for hay and grain. But in this case, there's no bank. So you have to enter through the basement and go up into the upper part on a ladder or staircase. And there are there's wonderful examples of these early ones because the foundations are almost all hand-laid stone, usually taken right out of the ground as they cleared fields. This is actually a ceramic tile dairy barn. This is a direct result of the scientific agriculture because it's very easy to clean, and when dairy and when milk faces sanitation regulation, which actually doesn't happen until 1945, you had to have a milk house and you had to have certain sanitation principles in place. One of them was whitewash on the interior if you didn't have a washable surface. And if you go into a barn and you see that it's all white inside, it's a sure sign that after 1945 it was used for dairy. And they frequently will have a small building attached to them called a milk house, which are required after 1945, but not before then. And they have to be made out of masonry. They can't be wooden structures so that you can hose them out. I'm sorry. Slideshows are meant to be used done in darkened rooms. So, but this is another stone foundation. I wanted to show you. This is actually concrete block built to look like split-face stone. And most of this in Indiana was manufactured in Warsaw. And it's called Warsaw block. And if you go to Warsaw, you'll see several houses that have this foundation, and you'll see several barns that have it. So it's basically a rusticated foundation, but it's concrete block. It's not hand-chipped limestone. So the tobacco barns on the left there are almost always 2 stories high, have a gabled roof, are very long, and have some kind of ventilation system built into the exterior structure itself. So I don't know if you can see it, but there are ventilated slits that go from the eave all the way to the ground every 3 or 4 feet, and those are usually operable. They just take the siding and they hinge it together so that you can open a panel of 2 or 3 boards when you're drying your tobacco. And there are lots of different ways that was done, but that's the most typical that we see in our area. Of course, tobacco was a huge crop until the sort of regulatory system changed the way it was not only grown but also marketed. And mostly it was grown in southern Indiana, so most of the tobacco barns we see are in southern Indiana. Here's another one. You can see the lighter boards are the ventilation slats. And this is an English barn, very similar to this barn that we're in southern Indiana, built on a single story, specifically for drying tobacco. So as tobacco becomes a more and more popular crop and a big money crop, people who have barns of all types adapt them for drying tobacco. So this was a threshing barn, a double door threshing barn like the one we're in, that was adapted for tobacco. And the reason I know that is because when you go in there in the timber frame, you see those round poles on the horizontal, that's for hanging tobacco. Here's another one right down the road from it. And I was doing this show for, I was on a trip in southern Indiana looking at barns, and I saw these barns not more than a mile apart. And I'd never quite seen that style before. And I was, surprised. And I asked around, and nobody seemed to know what they were, but when we got access to them, they turned out to be tobacco barns. But their origin is in the English barn. So they weren't built for tobacco, they were adapted for tobacco. And then decoration, which I had a student who wrote a thesis about barn decoration, different colors of paint, where it came from, and why barns were red, and all that. But I only learned about a week ago at our annual meeting that red paint originated from an herb grown in Sweden and Norway that had particular qualities of preservation. And so it was the ingredient that made the paint red that came from that origin was used because it helped protect the barn and keep it clean and keep it bug-free. And it wasn't because some people liked red, it was because that was the color of the ingredient. And of course it became very popular. You can't buy that paint. I don't know that it's made anywhere in this country. Now if you want to paint your barn, they recommend painting it with linseed oil paint. So it's not deadly like lead oil paint, but it's much more protective than any other paint that you can buy. So mail pouch, we all know about that. I don't know very much about the origins of decoration. It's something I've just never taken the time to really look into, but I'm sure that somebody will eventually, or somebody already has and I don't know about it, find out what the origins of these decorations are, because you see them over and over again. It's not like somebody just thought this up. You'll see this on other barns. Usually on the doors, always around the windows, is some kind of patterning. And I just have several examples. This one's very common. This round arch, double round arch on the doors. But again, I don't know if it has a national origin or a cultural origin. And here's another example of a similar thing. On the left side here is a stone milk house, which I was talking about. And here's the same one, slightly varied. Okay, round barns. So Indiana has about as many round barns left as any other state. Ohio also has a great many. Almost all round barns were built in the Midwest. Benton Steele and Horace Duncan are Hoosiers who helped develop the true round barn. Not polygonal barn, not a barn with many sides on it, but a true round form with a true round roof, okay? Circular roof, I should say. Often the roofs have double pitches or triple pitches. This is an example of a pair of true round barns. And Franklin King from the University of Wisconsin in that 1889 and 1910 period also simultaneously developed a true round barn. And there's been an argument among historians about who came first ever since. But as far as we can tell, they pretty much came to discovered the same system at the same time, pretty much the same time. And they became very, very popular between 1900, 1889 to 1990, to 1890, up to about 1920, and then you don't see them being built anymore. Here's a polygonal barn with a polygonal paneled roof, so it's flat surfaces, much easier to build. Here's a true round with a double conical roof. This is 4 stories tall when you get inside. An absolutely beautiful barn over on the west coast of the state. The rationale for these came out of the scientific revolution, agricultural revolution, that they were more efficient. That instead of walking up and down the aisle over and over again to feed your cows, if you will, you just walked in a circle once and you got the job done, and it was less time to travel, less footage to travel. If you had to drive your wagon around, you didn't have to go as far, and you always came back to where you started. You didn't have to walk over here and then walk back over here. You just went around in a circle. And people bought this. Now, is it actually true? When I do a job in my barn, I go do the job where I have to do it, and then I go do the next job. I'm not walking in circles around my barn in order to get my job done. So, no, it's probably not true for every task. But if your task is to drive your wagon around and drop a bale of hay off at every stall, yes, it's probably true. It's a little more efficient. They were sold as being tornado-proof. They're not. As a matter of fact, one of the nicest ones in the state just suffered terrible tornado damage a few months ago, and now the repair looks like it's going to be close to $5 million to repair. It took the round roof and completely distorted it. But they became very, very popular, and part of the progressive movement, and people, agriculturalists who wanted to be recognized for their inventiveness and their cleverness and the success of their farms, built round barns because they were cool, and they liked them, and there's a great deal of variation in them. I think in Indiana, there's a wonderful book called A Round Indiana, which you can buy. It's in its second edition, which has, the brilliance of it is that it catalogs all of the round barns built in Indiana, whether they're still standing or not. And it tells who built them, where they were, it locates them. It's written by a man named John Hanoi, who has also written a book now on round barns of Wisconsin and round barns of Illinois. Those two books aren't in print yet. And there's another book, I can't remember the title of it, but it's about round barns in Iowa. Those are the primary states that where round barns show up, and Ohio, but I don't think there's a book about Ohio.